Ghost Adventures has survived demonic attachments, physical attacks, and locations that hospitalized the crew. 29 seasons of evidence that nothing could shut this production down. Then season 30 happened. Cameras stopped rolling mid-investigation. Crew members were pulled from the location without explanation. Zak Bagans went silent in a way nobody around him had ever seen before. The official reason was never given, until now. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what forced production to halt is the one thing Bagans never wanted to say out loud. To understand the weight of what halted production on season 30 of Ghost Adventures, it is necessary to first understand what did not halt it across the 29 seasons that came before. Ghost Adventures has never been a production that paused for ordinary reasons. The show was built on the foundational premise that whatever the location produced, whatever physical, psychological, or paranormal pressure the investigation generated, the cameras kept rolling and the crew pushed through. That premise was not a television gimmick. It was a genuine operational commitment that Zak Bagans imposed on himself and his team from the earliest days of the franchise and maintained across circumstances that would have ended any other production. The documented history of what the Ghost Adventures crew endured across 29 seasons without stopping is extensive enough to constitute a record that no comparable production has come close to matching. Crew members were scratched, burned, and thrown by forces that no investigation ever identified with certainty. Bagans himself was hospitalized following the Demon House investigation, an experience he has described as the most physically and psychologically destructive of his career, and returned to production. The Demon House film documented a level of personal deterioration in Bagans that was visible on camera across the duration of the shoot, and when it was over, he came back to the series. Equipment was destroyed at rates that no mechanical explanation accounted for. Investigators reported experiences during lockdowns that altered their understanding of reality, in ways they have described publicly only in the most general terms. None of it stopped the cameras. The production developed an institutional culture over those 29 seasons that treated the pressure the investigations generated not as a reason to pause, but as confirmation that the work was being done in the right places, with the right commitment. Bagans set that culture personally, and maintained it through example, through the visible record of what the investigations cost him, and the equally visible record of his refusal to let that cost change his relationship to the work. When crew members struggled, the framework Bagans had established around the production absorbed that struggle and kept moving. When locations produced phenomena that exceeded the crew's preparation, the response was documentation rather than retreat. 29 seasons, hundreds of investigations, an unbroken operational commitment to staying in the location, regardless of what the location produced. That is the baseline against which the halt of season 30 production must be measured. Whatever Bagans encountered during that season did not just exceed the threshold of what he was personally willing to document on camera. It exceeded the threshold of what 29 seasons of institutional hardening had prepared the entire production to continue operating through. That is the only context in which a production halt means what this one means. Season 30 of Ghost Adventures entered production carrying a weight of expectation that no prior season had accumulated in quite the same way. The show had spent 29 seasons building a body of documented evidence that the paranormal research community, the scientific community adjacent to it, and the growing mainstream audience for UAP and anomalous phenomenon disclosure had been following with increasing seriousness. The broader cultural conversation around these phenomena had shifted significantly during the period leading up to season 30. Congressional hearings, intelligence community disclosures, and the gradual entry of institutional credibility into a subject that had spent decades being treated as fringe material had created a climate in which Ghost Adventures occupied a different position in the public conversation than it had during any of its prior seasons. Bagans understood that position and the responsibility it carried. The production decisions made going into season 30 reflected that understanding. The locations selected for investigation were not chosen through the standard development process that had driven prior season lineups. They were chosen with a specific intentionality, a deliberate decision to pursue the categories of evidence and the classes of location that the prior 29 seasons had been building toward without ever fully reaching. The preliminary research conducted on the season 30 locations before cameras rolled was more extensive than anything the production had undertaken in its prior history. The consultants brought in to advise on specific investigations included individuals whose institutional backgrounds were not the kind that typically appear in paranormal television production credits. The equipment deployed across the season incorporated technology that had not been part of the Ghost Adventures investigative toolkit in prior seasons, instruments whose sensitivity and specificity reflected a production that was no longer approaching the investigations as television content to be shaped into episodic entertainment, but as a research operation whose findings needed to be documented with the precision that the significance of those findings demanded. The crew that assembled for season 30 was the most experienced iteration of the Ghost Adventures operation in the franchise's history. The institutional knowledge accumulated across 29 seasons of fieldwork, the technical sophistication of the investigative methodology, and the personal resilience that the team had developed through 2 decades of sustained exposure to extreme paranormal phenomenon had brought the production to a point of operational capability that no prior season had been able to deploy. Everything about season 30, in other words, was designed to go further than the show had ever gone. What nobody in the production had fully accounted for was the possibility that going further than the show had ever gone would put them in contact with something that the show's entire prior history had not prepared them to encounter. The investigation that forced the production halt did not occur at the first location on the season 30 schedule. The season had been progressing through its planned lineup, producing footage that by the accounts of those present was already exceeding anything captured in prior seasons, before the crew arrived at the specific location where the halt occurred. That location has not been publicly identified by any party connected to the production. What has surfaced through the research surrounding the production halt is a geographic region, a class of reported phenomenon associated with the site, and a documented history of prior investigation attempts at the location that establishes it as a place that has resisted outside examination in ways that go beyond simple logistical difficulty. The site had been on the Ghost Adventures research team's list of potential investigation locations for several seasons before it was selected for season 30. The reasons it had not been pursued in prior seasons were practical: access difficulties, the complexity of the permissions required to bring a production crew onto the property, and questions about whether the investigative infrastructure the show had available in those earlier seasons was adequate for what the preliminary evidence suggested the location might produce. By season 30, the access had been arranged, the permissions had been secured, and the production had determined that its investigative capability had reached the level required to approach the location responsibly. The history of the site that the research team compiled during the pre-production phase of season 30 is not the kind of history that appears on the standard paranormal location profiles the show had worked from in prior seasons. The documented anomalous activity associated with the location spans a period of time that predates modern record keeping. The accounts of local populations with generational connection to the area describe the site in terms that are consistent across independent sources separated by significant spans of time, consistent not in their cultural framing, but in the specific characteristics of the phenomenon they describe. Prior investigation attempts by parties whose institutional backgrounds have not been fully identified in the available record ended without the investigators publicly disclosing what they encountered. The pattern of those non-disclosures, the consistency with which people who went to that location chose silence over documentation, is the detail in the pre-production research that the Ghost Adventures team noted, and that Bagans has since referenced as the warning sign the production understood intellectually, but did not fully internalize before the cameras arrived. The Ghost Adventures crew arrived at the season 30 halt location with the full weight of the production's operational capability deployed and a level of anticipation that the prior research had generated among everyone involved. The first days of the investigation proceeded in a manner that was anomalous by the standards of any prior Ghost Adventures investigation, while remaining within the range of what the crew's 29 seasons of experience had prepared them to document and manage. The baseline readings taken across the location in the opening phase of the investigation established an environmental profile that the production's technical team described in their field notes as unlike anything in the show's prior measurement history. The electromagnetic variance across the site was not elevated in the localized pattern that typically characterizes active paranormal locations, concentrated in specific areas while the surrounding environment registers normal. It was elevated uniformly across the entire footprint of the investigation site, at levels that the instruments had difficulty calibrating against because the readings fell outside the range the equipment had been configured to expect. The acoustic environment of the location carried properties in the infrasound range that the crew's audio specialist documented on the first day and flagged immediately as requiring explanation before the investigation advanced further. Infrasound, sound below the threshold of human hearing, has been documented in prior Ghost Adventures investigations as a potential contributor to the feelings of unease and perceptual disturbance that investigators report at active locations. What the measurements at the season 30 location produced was not a trace presence of infrasound at the margins of the documented range. It was a sustained and structured pattern of infrasound emission that the audio specialists' field notes describe as appearing to originate from within the ground beneath the investigation site rather than from any surface-level source. The crew's response to the first days of the investigation was documented on camera in a manner consistent with the Ghost Adventures format: professional engagement with the anomalous readings, methodical advancement through the location, and the disciplined documentation of evidence that 29 seasons of operational practice had made second nature. What the camera footage from those first days also documents in ways that are visible without being commented on by anyone on the crew is a quality of environmental pressure building across the site that the investigators are registering physically and behaviorally in ways that go beyond what the standard Ghost Adventures investigation produces, even at the most active locations in the show's prior history. The specific event that precipitated the production halt occurred during a nighttime lockdown session at the Season 30 location, the phase of the Ghost Adventures investigation format in which the crew seals themselves inside the site with no outside contact and operates in conditions of minimal artificial light with the full range of the production's investigative technology running continuously. The lockdown sessions in the first days of the Season 30 investigation had produced evidence that the crew was documenting with the professional composure that the show's operational culture demanded. What the lockdown session on the night of the halt produced was something that the operational culture the production had spent 29 seasons building was not sufficient to absorb. The sequence of events that preceded the halt began with an escalation in the environmental readings that the crew's instruments had been tracking since the first day. An escalation that was not gradual but stepped, moving in discrete increments that the technical team's field notes describe as having the character of a system responding to external input rather than a natural environmental fluctuation. The electromagnetic readings crossed a threshold during that escalation that caused two of the production's primary camera units to enter protective shutdown simultaneously. The audio equipment remained operational, and its recordings from the relevant period document what was occurring in the location during the window in which the primary cameras were down in a form that the Ghost Adventures production team has not made public, but that individuals with access to the raw production materials have described in consistent terms. When the primary cameras came back online, the footage they captured from that point forward is the footage that Bagans has identified as the reason production was halted. It does not document an ambiguous paranormal event that the investigation was unable to fully account for. It documents something that everyone present understood immediately and completely, an understanding that is visible in the behavior of every crew member captured on camera from the moment the primary units resumed recording. The decision to halt was not made by a network executive reviewing footage remotely. It was made on site by Bagans. Within the lockdown session itself, the cameras documented that decision being made. And what is visible on those cameras in the moments before Bagans made it is the full explanation for why 29 seasons of institutional momentum was not enough to keep the investigation going. Zak Bagans has been physically harmed by paranormal investigations before. He has been psychologically affected by locations and phenomena in ways he has documented publicly and discussed with a candor that most people in his position would not be willing to demonstrate on camera. The Demon House investigation produced changes in him that were visible to everyone around him, and that he has acknowledged in the years since as representing a permanent alteration in his relationship to the phenomena he investigates. None of that prior experience is adequate context for what the Season 30 location produced in Bagans during the lockdown session that halted the production. The accounts of crew members present during the relevant period describe a man whose response to what the investigation encountered went beyond the range of reactions that 29 seasons of extreme fieldwork had established as his baseline. The composure that Bagans maintains on camera, even in the most extreme investigative circumstances, a composure that is not performed but is the product of genuine psychological hardening accumulated across decades of direct exposure, was not present during the lockdown session that ended the season. What replaced it is something that the people present that night have struggled to characterize accurately in the limited indirect accounts that have surfaced. The closest consistent description across those accounts is recognition, not fear in the conventional sense, not confusion, but the particular quality of response that occurs when a person often encounters something that confirms rather than challenges their understanding of the world, and the confirmation is of something they had spent years hoping would not be confirmed. Bagans has spent 20 years investigating paranormal phenomenon with the conviction that the phenomenon is real, and the evidence for its reality deserves to be documented and seen. What the Season 30 location produced during that lockdown session did not deepen that conviction. It resolved it in a direction that the prior 29 seasons of evidence had been pointing toward without ever fully arriving at. The resolution was not the one anyone in the production had prepared for, not because it contradicted what the evidence had been suggesting, but because it confirmed it in a form that was immediate, unambiguous, and impossible to process within the investigative framework that had guided the production across its entire history. The physical effects on Bagans in the days following the halt have been described by those close to him as consistent with the aftermath of the Demon House investigation, but more acute in their onset and more specific in their character. He did not return to the location. The production did not resume. And the explanation he has now provided for why the halt occurred is the first time he has been willing to say in precise terms what the investigation found, because it is the first time he has been certain that saying it will be understood rather than dismissed. The communication between Zak Bagans and Travel Channel following the production halt on Season 30 did not follow the standard protocol that governs the relationship between a show's production team and its broadcast network when unexpected events disrupt a filming schedule. Standard protocol in those circumstances involves a producer-level conversation about logistics, timeline adjustments, and the contractual implications of a production delay. What happened following the Season 30 halt was not that conversation. It was a different kind of communication entirely, one that people familiar with the exchange have described as carrying a quality of weight and specificity that distinguished it immediately from any prior interaction between Bagans and the network across the show's production history. Bagans made contact with Travel Channel within hours of the halt occurring. The account he provided of the reason for the halt was not a general reference to crew safety concerns, or an ambiguous description of conditions at the location that made continued filming inadvisable. It was a specific account of what the investigation had encountered during the lockdown session, specific enough that the network's response did not include any of the questions that a genuinely uninformed party would have asked upon receiving it. There were no requests for clarification about the nature of the phenomenon. There were no expressions of skepticism about the account being provided. The network's response to Bagans' communication was immediate, was made at a level of the organization above the standard production executive chain, and was oriented not toward resuming production but toward the footage that had already been captured during the Season 30 investigation before the halt occurred. That orientation, the network's first significant response being about the footage rather than about the production schedule, tells a specific story about where Travel Channel's institutional priorities landed when the halt was communicated. A network whose primary concern was its broadcast schedule would have led with questions about when production could resume and what the implications were for the season's delivery timeline. A network whose primary concern was the footage led with questions about where the footage was, who had access to it, and what the chain of custody looked like from the point of capture to the present moment. Travel Channel led with the footage. The speed and specificity of the network's response to the halt communication, and the particular direction that response took, is consistent with an institution that had existing protocols for exactly this category of situation. Protocols that did not need to be developed in response to Bagans' communication because they had been developed in advance of it. That preparedness is not something a cable television network develops on its own initiative in response to the ordinary operational risks of producing paranormal documentary content. It is something a cable television network develops when an outside party with a demonstrated interest in managing the information environment around anomalous phenomenon has communicated to them at some prior point that the possibility of this category of situation arising is one they need to be ready for. Who that outside party is and when that communication occurred are questions that the available record does not answer directly. What the available record does answer is that when Bagans told Travel Channel what had halted his production, the network already knew what he was talking about. The footage captured during the Season 30 investigation before the production halt is currently held by Travel Channel under the contractual authority that has governed every frame of Ghost Adventures footage since the series began. That authority has been exercised in the period following the halt in a manner entirely consistent with the network's prior pattern. The footage has been secured, Access has been restricted, and no broadcast timeline for any portion of the Season 30 material has been communicated to the production team. Bagans retains what the network cannot control: the field notes, the instrument data logs, and the written crew accounts compiled immediately following the halt that constitute a parallel record of the investigation, independent of the camera footage. That parallel record was preserved deliberately. Bagans has watched the editorial process, stripped the most significant evidence from season after season for 20 years. He knew what the network would do with the footage before they did it. The instrument data from the lockdown session is the most significant element of that parallel record. The readings captured across the full investigative technology suite during the relevant period have been reviewed by two individuals with technical backgrounds whose independent assessments agree the data does not correspond to any known natural phenomenon and cannot be accounted for within any existing scientific framework. The footage itself remains the element of the Season 30 record whose public availability is most uncertain. Bagans has indicated the decision about how to bring it forward is one he is actively working through. What he has disclosed about its contents is consistent with the instrument data and consistent with every crew account from that night. The footage shows what the data recorded, and what the data recorded is what stopped everything.